It's a pleasure to be with you today as well. And as I mentioned yesterday I made the case, namely for Gavi, and to explain to you what we are doing, namely in Africa, for vaccination, and also the initiative that we have launched of African Vaccine Manufacturing Accelerator. But yesterday I mentioned to you that today, also as a framework for our discussions, I would present to you some points about the current global situation. Of course, it's my personal opinion. I'm not here representing any institution, certainly not the European Union, even if naturally I reflect the European and the Portuguese point of view, and certainly not representing Gavi on this kind of intervention. It's my opinion. Since I left office, political office, I can say that my level of sincerity is increasing day by day. So it's a personal opinion. It may be wrong, but it's, I think, intellectually honest. But of course, there are issues of subjectivity. And you remember, those of you who were here last year, that already then I was quite worried and concerned about the global political situation. And in fact, it did not improve. If anything, it's even worse than last year. We have not only the continuation, as predicted, of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, but we have, of course, a very dramatic situation in the Middle East, and we have generalization of conflicts around the world, and the situation of tension globally between our governments and between the countries all over the world, but also inside our societies, inside our countries, including democratic countries that are becoming extremely polarized. And what happened just 3 days ago in the United States of America, certainly the most influential country in the world, an attempt of assassination of former President Trump, is indeed an indicator of increased levels of polarization that we see all over the world. We saw also in Europe with the rise of extremist forces. Let's not forget also recent attempts of assassination of political leaders, including the Prime Minister of Slovakia. And so we are seeing this situation where we have more and more polarized forces from the far right, but sometimes also from the far left, that are putting a lot of tension in our political systems, namely in our democracies. I will mainly speak about Europe, but of course you know the situation in Africa. We have seen also several several coup d'etat, namely in Western Africa. We have seen democracy showing its resilience, after all, in some very important countries like South Africa, where it was very important for the first time the ANC, the historic movement of liberation and against apartheid in South Africa, had to accept that it had not a majority, but democracy was, in fact, helpful because a majority was found through compromise, through coalition, as it happens normally, or it can happen in democracy. So we are seeing a very diverse situation, but a situation that is certain at global level, one that I will describe, as I described last year. It's more polarized, more uncertain, more fragmented, more unpredictable, more dangerous. And this is the situation where we are moving and where we have to place our relations between Africa and the European Union. As predicted last year, the war between Russia and Ukraine was not going to end soon, and it's there still. It's true that President Trump, candidate, promised that if he gets elected, we'll solve it in one day. Maybe it will take more time than that. Anyhow, it's certain that we have this situation of war, and even if there is some kind of truce or agreement, or at least a ceasefire, or some kind of trying to freeze the conflict, one thing is sure: it's not going to be a situation like before. We are not going to come back to the status quo ante. There is a situation in Europe of increased tension, and of course that was certainly the result of the actions of President Putin. If his idea was to reduce the scope of NATO, in fact he has increased NATO. Now we have Finland and Sweden members of NATO. We also have Denmark joining by referendum the European security and defense architecture. As you know, Denmark, they have not only an opt-out for the euro, but they also have an opt-out for defense. So we are seeing increased tension, and even if there is that kind of ceasefire, let's hope, because we can estimate at least 500,000 of young people dying already in that war. Most on the Russian side, but also on the Ukrainian side. So many lives of young people that are being lost in a war that, in fact, makes no sense. So that's why, even if that we come to this kind of stabilization on that conflict, the reality is that NATO is going to continue to build forces, Russia is going to continue to do the same, and there will be a situation of mistrust between us in Europe, which is, of course, a tragedy, namely a tragedy for Ukraine, because around 20% of that territory is being occupied, but it's also a tragedy for the young people from Russia that are dying, but it's very dramatic for Europe as a whole and for the world. I know that outside Europe, many people say, oh, the Europeans, when they have a problem, they believe their problem is global. After all, it's a conflict in Europe. There are many conflicts in Africa or in Southeast Asia, in other parts of the world. Why all this fuss about Europe? The reality is that it's a global conflict. Whether we like it or not, a European problem usually has a temptation to become a global conflict. In fact, we should not forget that the two world wars, by far the most devastating in the history of mankind, were wars that were basically European wars that afterwards were spreading all over the world. And in fact, today what we have, whether we like it or not, that's the advantage of no longer being in office, so I can be completely sincere. We have on one side Europe and the United States and some of its allies, from Canada to Japan to Australia and others. On the other side, we have Russia and China politically supporting, not being involved directly in the war, but in fact supporting politically Russia. But also we have countries like Iran or North Korea on the side of Russia, including supplying weapons to Russia. So we have already a situation that goes well beyond the limits of Europe. And that's, in fact, accelerating trends that we have seen already before the war of Ukraine, and we saw it in the pandemic, and also before the growing competition, global competition, superpower competition between the United States and China. China being today the challenger to the preeminence of the United States. And it is in this situation that we have to consider, of course, all our geopolitical issues. In fact, it's different from the Soviet Union-United States competition, because the Soviet Union was certainly a very important power, namely in weapons, in defense, or in military terms, but it was never, frankly, a challenger to the American economic preeminence. So the United States were certainly by far the most developed country economically, but also technologically, scientifically, and in economic terms. And its economy was much more successful than the communist system of the Soviet Union. Today, we have a different situation, where, in fact, China is competing for the first place in economic terms, but also with increasing efforts in the field of science and technology. That's the current situation. What we have then today is a very problematic issue for the rest of the world, because there is already some efforts of decoupling. So a complete separation of the two systems. On one side, US and its allies. On the other side, China, also with increasing influence in other parts of the world. Europe's trying to keep the world open for business, even if naturally Europe is closer to the United States than to China, namely because of NATO. Most countries of NATO are members of the European Union. Most members of the European Union are members of NATO. And there are, besides that, many issues of convergence and identity and closeness between the United States and Europe, but the reality is that Europe has a slightly different position from the US. That's why it was coined in Europe, not the expression decouplement, but the expression de-risking. So we should de-risk our relationship from China, but not completely decouple. The problem is that in some areas, this is almost unavoidable, because we are also living in the middle of a scientific and technological revolution today. some people compared, the late Henry Kissinger, that was in fact coming to Portugal last year, and I had the honor of and pleasure of hosting him, he was saying that what's happening with artificial intelligence is certainly more important than the Industrial Revolution and probably comparable to the invention of the wheel or the invention of fire in the history of mankind. But the combination of artificial intelligence, new types of artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, what some people, including Sam Altman, calls super intelligence. So for the first time, we as mankind are realizing that there are forms of intelligence that are higher than our intelligence. Until now, we considered ourselves Homo sapiens, the most intelligent entity in the world. For those who are believers, God above us, but we are the most intelligent entity in the world. No longer. Now we have machines that are able to solve problems that we can no longer solve. It's not just a matter of speed and scale. That's, of course, the obvious advantage of supercomputing, superintelligence, quantum computing, AI, but also in terms of problems that we cannot solve. And sometimes, when those machines solve them, we don't understand how they can do it. So it's a complete change, not only technological, scientific, but also, I would say, even philosophically. The world we are living is no longer the same we are living some time ago. But the problem is that while some of these technologies, including AI, are extremely powerful in terms of great things for mankind, namely health, public health, because of my role at Gavi, I had the privilege of being in contact with some of the great scientists in this field. And it's amazing, the progress in terms of medicine, personal medicine, and others, including possible cure of cancer, some of the more difficult cancers. So I hope generation of my sons will see it completely disseminated. Unfortunately, probably not my generation. But the reality is that these technologies is also technology for war. Because the AI implemented to systems of weapons and war, of course, it's a major game changer, and this is why there will not be complete cooperation between the big powers of the world in that field. So we have to be prepared at least for a more fragmented world, and that's what we are seeing now. China, with its traditional state-owned companies, and of course a directed policy in economic terms, but the United States also with IRA, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, that is in fact a huge protectionist program, complete protectionist, and it's launched not by Trump, but by President Biden. And also Europe is trying to bring back the supply chain. So one thing I can summarize is today we have at least, as the new phase of globalization, the regionalization. The Chinese focus much more on Asia, and that's why extending their Belt and Road Initiative, the United States much more on their own country. It's not, and the question we have now to think is it America first or is it America alone? That's the issue. And also in the Americas, but also with Canada and Mexico, and Europe trying also to bring back their, or our supply chains. And that's why we have to consider this also for the relations between Europe and Africa. Are we going to do it alone, the Europeans on one side, the Africans on another, or are we going to promote inclusiveness and some kind of, as I said last year, complicity between Europe and Africa? Of course, I think that most of us here, and myself certainly, we are in favor of a closer relationship between Europe and Africa, also because of the complementarities we have, also because, as we have mentioned yesterday, not only the geographic closeness, historic relationship. Of course, there was in the past colonialism. No one can be proud of colonialism, but it's at the same time true that those periods, the history, has brought Europeans and Africans together in terms of cultural closeness, linguistic, and in fact, sometimes a willingness to participate and to cooperate, that it's very important. So the world in a very difficult moment today, and I believe that Europe and Africa can be part of this complicity, trying to avoid some of the extremist positions that we see in the world that will be in favor of full decoupling. Because it's obvious, but sometimes we have to repeat the obvious, global problems require global solution. There is not a possibility to solve the problem of global climate change without global cooperation. Europe is now around 7% of global emissions. So even if Europe tomorrow achieves full decarbonization, the goal is to achieve it by 2050, but even if it's tomorrow, of course that will not solve the problem, because the two biggest emitters are China and the US. But also you have to think about India, about Russia, about many other parts of the world that are very important, that they will have very important growth in the future. So climate change requires cooperation. Public health, like the virus does not need infectious diseases and virus, they don't need visas to travel, so it requires cooperation. So my hope is that, not being naive about the global geopolitical situation that, in my point of view, is going to become worse, it's important that at the same time we cooperate at least for the so-called global public goods, including sustainable development, including helping those that need more development, not just as a matter of justice and fairness and solidarity and humanitarian support, but also because of an issue of our own self-interest in Europe. We need that to grow, because we are, in fact, in Europe with some problems of growth. The United States, in spite of its issues and problems, remains among the biggest powers, the most dynamic economy, the #1 economic power, technological, not to mention, of course, defense. They have a growth mindset that in Europe we are lacking. Europe is getting older, so less dynamism that we have seen in other parts of the world, including our American partners and friends. So we need to invest more in the growth in Europe, and we need to see where growth can come from. And as I said earlier, I think in the future, Africa is the biggest reserve of growth for the global economy. We are seeing the economic situation in Asia. Some of those countries, including China, are becoming close to maturity. They have grown exponentially. In fact, the growth of China in the last 30 years is the most important history of economic growth in the history of mankind. Amazing, the growth of China from all points of view. But they are reaching what we call the point of maturity. So they will not be able to continue for the 7 or sometimes double digits growth that they had in the past. So where is going to growth come from in the future? Partly from Africa, with the most dynamic demographics and also the creativity of the African people and also all the natural resources that Africa has. And by the way, now we see also, because including of AI and supercomputing, we see an increased competition of critical earths, special critical materials that is important also from a geoeconomic and a geopolitical point of view. All these reasons are in favor of putting Europe and Africa together. Sometimes people, in the commentators and the political analysts, they say, oh, there is a competition for Africa, and on one side China, on the other side the West, and so on. They tend to forget one thing. They usually look at Africa as passive subjects of that competition, if the Africans had not their own ideas. Of course, the Africans have their own ideas. They know very well what they are doing, the governments of Africa. And they are choosing sometimes the partners. They are sometimes making some competition between the partners. One point is clear. Instead of being worried about the others, we have to do our homework. We as Europeans, now I mean it. If we want to continue to be one of the, if not the most important, because on its whole, the European Union continues to be the most important partner of Africa, we have to do our homework and to show with full respect of the African choices that we can be a partner of choice, that we have a lot to offer to Africa in the interest of Africa and the interest of our joint development. This is the important point, respecting, of course, the choices of the Africans themselves. And it's, as always, I like to end with that quote. It's a quote of an African American. In fact, it was Aretha Franklin, but before Aretha Franklin, it was Otis Redding. All I need is some respect. We need respect in the relationship between Africa and the European Union and Europe as a whole. And if this is the case, I believe we can work together for the common good of Africa, of Europe, but also of the global community. I thank you very much for your kind attention.